Hi everyone. I figured I would start with a little bit of an introduction just in case not everyone was able to watch my introductory video. My name is Teresa. I am located in the suburbs of Philadelphia. For work, I'm an outpatient therapist in the evening, so after school hours for children and adolescents. And then during the day, I work in an intensive learning support classroom in an elementary school. So this week, I am summarizing Chapter 5 in About Behaviorism by Skinner. And I don't know about you all, but I found Skinner to be a little bit difficult to summarize and put into my own words just because his language is so specific and honestly not really what I'm used to in the counseling field. The chapters on perception, I pulled out the key points and points that stood out to me. I have them on a Word document, so if it looks like I'm reading, it's because I am. So, Skinner begins with proposing that the conscious content may be the most difficult problem faced by behaviorism, and he spends the chapter pulling apart different views of perception. So he begins with a person responds to the world around him in the sense of acting upon it. He mentions different views on perception, one being mentalistic view, which proposes that the person takes in the environment, processes it, and then eventually responds to it after we process it in our minds. And I actually teach this view to a lot of my clients because I explain that negative feelings that they might be experiencing, such as anxiety or sadness, may be in response to something they perceived as negative or threatening in the environment. But Skinner explains that a behavioristic view is similar but different in that the environment itself actually initiates action, not the person. So he says that the environment stays where it is and where it has always been, outside the body. So my understanding of that is that the environment never actually permeates the body or mind. It is also noteworthy that the environment not only affects the person before, but also after our response, which is what Skinner describes as the antecedent and the consequence, which we have learned. So other key points that he touches on in the beginning of the chapter are generalization and discrimination. I have always understood generalization as our tendency to respond to the same way to similar situations. For example, in the Watson experiment, the child in the experiment ended up being conditioned to not only be afraid of the rabbit, but also anything else that was white or fluffy. The fear was generalized across several similar conditions. And then discrimination is when we respond differently only when a particular property is present. In other words, we're able to distinguish between different conditions even if they are similar. So the best example that I could think of for this would be Pavlov's dogs in that experiment. If they were to salivate only when they hear a bell, but not when they hear a trumpet sound. So in that situation, they're discriminating between the similar but different sounds. So then Skinner goes on to describe that perception is actually intentional or purposeful, which sounded significant to me. And it's purposeful in that we are actively responding to our environment. He states that we are not just spectators, though, and the mind does not just take a back seat in the process, which I think sometimes, for me, I think he is describing that the mind takes a back seat, but he kind of clarified that for me in this chapter. So he describes that there are several conditions that may impact the way that we respond to our environment. For example, he talked about deprivation and the history of the perceiver as things that influence us and influence how we respond to the environment around us. And this whole idea basically states that when we respond to certain stimuli based on the current conditions, as well as what has happened when we have been in contact with it. So this became clear for me when Skinner describes playing chess. So someone who is an expert in chess is going to respond to that stimuli, the game itself, and to looking at the board different than someone who's new to the game. And another example would be, actually today was the first day of school for us, and this is my second year there. So my response to the environment and the students that I'm working with were different than a couple of the new aides that came in. And so my day was much different than theirs because that's the history of the perceiver, which is me. So that kind of clarified that point for me. Next, Skinner made the point that behaviorism does not acknowledge that our perceptions may be based on our individual views, and he describes that as what it might look like to us, how we interpret a certain stimulus, or what meaning it holds for us. And he explains that if we take those things into account, that would be assuming that the brain holds data and creates a hypothesis on the information around us. Instead, he proposes that our perceptions are simply evidence of our senses and that we are simply responding to the environment and its contingencies in that moment. So we're not storing anything in our mind that we're going back to retrieve. We are simply responding in that moment. Further, our responses are different and individualized because we've been exposed to different contingencies of reinforcement. So our behaviors are based on that. He then talks about the copy theory, which I had never heard of before. But the copy theory basically states that we see copies of the world around us. And he uses the example that we simply do not hear music, we hear an inner production of it. And that example kind of shed light on the theory for me. I didn't quite understand it until that sentence in the chapter. And he said that the copy theory neglects the behavior of seeing and therefore is not behavioral in nature. He talked about terms like remembering or reminiscing, which he also refers to as seeing in the absence of the thing seen. So we're seeing things in our mind, we're using our imagination, we might be daydreaming, a song might be stuck in our head. And he explains that these aren't copies, but instead we are engaging in the term perceptual behavior, which again is another term that I never heard of before. But perceptual behavior allows us to engage in behaviors that have been previously reinforced. So if we're daydreaming about a city that we love or a person that we love or that we miss. And then he also describes dreams as being a perfect example of perceptual behavior. Because when we're dreaming, we're asleep. So obviously, the external stimuli around us has less control because we're sleeping. And so in that moment, our histories and emotions are able to come into play more when we're dreaming. So I thought that discussion was pretty interesting. So lastly, Skinner ends with a discussion about the mind, which he said can be a noun, it can be a verb, and we use the word mind to refer to many different things. So in this section, my understanding was that Skinner wanted to make the distinction between reporting perceptions or sensations and just simply the act of seeing. So they're different. And for him, if we're just talking about the simple act of seeing, this maintains that the environment stays external to us rather than permeating the mind and being processed before we react to it. So we are just seeing plainly. Okay, so that's my summary of the chapter. I tried to hit on each key point that stood out to me, as well as how the chapter was sectioned. So lastly, the discussion question that I wanted to ask you all was, what do you think about the idea that perception should not take meaning or personal interpretations into account? Because I feel like in my work as a therapist, I'm always searching for meaning with my clients. So this whole idea of kind of stripping that away is new for me. And I understand the benefits of just looking at behavior and stripping all of that away. But I'm wondering, first, what do you think about that? What is your initial reaction to that whole idea? And then, do you think that can be applied to everyone in every situation, whether it's anxiety or depression, can we always strip away those feelings and just address the behavior? Yeah, I have several different thoughts on that, so I'm interested to see what you all think. So I guess next you are responding to this video. This is my first time making one of these, so I hope it's good. I'm open to any feedback, so please feel free in your responses to give me feedback on what I can change or what I can do differently. Thanks everyone.